President and Vice Chancellor, University of Regina. And I want to begin by respectfully acknowledging that the University of Regina, with its three federated colleges, the First Nations University of Canada, Campion College, and Luther College, is situated on Treaty 4 territory. And in Saskatchewan, with our nursing and social work faculty, we are in Treaty 6, and these are traditional territories of the Naewak, the Ashinepak, the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland also of the Métis Michif Nation. And today, these lands continue to be the shared territory of many diverse peoples from near and from far. I'm delighted to be here in beautiful and historic Dark Hall to help launch the What Are Universities For symposium, and in particular to hear ideas being explored in this pre-symposium panel. The question posed for discussion this evening, and indeed the entire symposium, is pretty straightforward on the surface. What are universities for? But its apparent simplicity belies its complexity. As you can imagine, we all have a lot of views on this topic. I'm not going to detail mine here, but a couple of straightforward answers come to mind for me right away when I think of where we are in historic Dark Hall and the diverse group of people who are here this evening. Given that Dark Hall was originally constructed nearly a century ago and saved from demolition in the past decade, it's now been revitalized for another century of use. I'm a historian, and I think that this building holds an answer, at least in part, to that question. For one thing, universities are meant to preserve our collective history. They're meant to build upon that history. They are meant to continually reinterpret it and ensure that it remains an important part and relevant for future generations. So in a way, revitalized Dark Hall was symbolic of what universities are for. Dark Hall is also symbolic of what universities are for when I think of how and when it was constructed and why it was revitalized, both by the wider community and for the wider community. Universities are not to be the proverbial ivory towers, but rather should be places, and they must be places, for everyone. And I see that here tonight in this space, which, while belonging to the University of Regina, is about to enter its second century as a venue for the wider community to gather in. In that context, the who that is gathered here this evening is very significant. Who do we have here? We have students, we have faculty, we have staff, we have people from government, we have interested citizens, we have business leaders, and even a national media figure in Nala Ayan. The fact that we are here this evening in this community space to consider the purpose of universities as another dimension as to why universities do exist, to bring diverse people together to discuss ideas, agree on some points, the nature of the university, to disagree on others, and at the end of the day, leave this space feeling challenged and inspired to make our communities better. But of course, these are only some of initial thoughts. There are many perspectives on why universities are what they're here for, and how they should go about achieving that purpose. And that's not a new question. It's not. In fact, more than 20 years ago, it was posed right here at the University of Regina as we entered what was then called the New Millennium. At that time, longtime professor and administrator, Dr. Murray Nudala, gathered a diverse group of people for a discussion on universities in the 21st century. And the Canadian Plains Research Centre, now known as the University of Regina Press, published the proceedings in a book that was called Heritage and Hope, the University of Regina in the 21st Century. Questions that were then considered included, what is the role of the contemporary university? How do we create a scholarly environment in which students can develop their various potentials and possibilities? What is the appropriate mix of teaching and scholarship and research? How does a university balance its financial needs with limited public funding and possible external funding while protecting the essential autonomy that is part of the raison d'etre, part of the definition of a university? And the resulting discussion focused on a wide variety of issues, including science, technology, and social change, citizenship, equity, and community, empowering alternative viewpoints, and the moral and ethical discipline of building the university. Certainly sounds familiar in today's context, doesn't it? As a university and as a university sector, we clearly haven't fully answered all those questions in the intervening 2 decades, or else this symposium would not be necessary. The fact that those questions remain relevant today, is a testament to the University of Regina's continued relevance in Canada. Now and then, we are leading in this discussion, a national discussion, on the role of universities. And for that, I would like to offer my sincere gratitude for the leadership, of Dr. Marc Spooner, who is facilitating this symposium. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you. In closing, I want to express my appreciation as well to our moderator, to our panelists, our distinguished panelists, and to all those who are participating here tonight and at the symposium in the coming days. Your support for the University of Regina and the university sector as a whole is something we do not take for granted. I hope you enjoy the evening, the many productive discussions, many productive interpretations that it will produce. It's now my pleasure to introduce one of our excellent students, Whitney Blaisdell. Whitney is an award-winning PhD student in the Faculty of Education. She is a former public school teacher, current co-chair of the Regina and Area Early Childhood Network. She is executive director of Project Play YQR, that's Regina, for those who are visiting, a nonprofit organization founded around her graduate research, which examines play. Whitney, the floor is yours.
Good evening. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing your amazing panelist and moderator this evening. On your far right, you'll meet Dr. Jonathan R. Cole. Dr. Jonathan R. Cole is the multiple award-winning John Mitchell Mason Professor at Columbia and has spent his academic career at Columbia University. Dr. Cole has critiqued peer review in science as an old boys club network of self-reinforcing elites and has examined the role and treatment of women in the scientific community. Several of his published book titles include Fair Science, Women in the Scientific Community, The Research University in a Time of Discontent, The Great American University, Its Rise to Preeminence, Its Indispensable National Role, Why It Must Be Protected, and Who's Afraid of Academic Freedom. Next, sure, you can applaud. Next, we meet Dr. Linda Tahiwai-Smith. Dr. Linda Tahiwai-Smith is an internationally accomplished scholar and researcher who serves as Distinguished Professor at the University of Awanyurawani. Dr. Linda Tahiwai-Smith's groundbreaking book, De-colonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous Peoples, remains an international bestseller since its publication in 1998, and is a major contribution to research methods in social justice research. Aside from many, many awards, she is honored as a Companion of New Zealand Order of Merit for her services in education and to Maori people, and is named a Fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand. In 2017, Dr. Linda Tahiwai-Smith received the Prime Minister's Award for Lifetime Achievement in Education. Next is Dr. Joel Westheimer, who is a university research chair in democracy and education at the University of Ottawa and an education columnist for CBC Radio. Renowned speaker, award-winning author, and education advocate, Westheimer's work focuses on schools and education reform in democratic societies. His books include the critically acclaimed What Kind of Citizen? Educating Our Children for the Common Good, Pledging Allegiance, The Politics of Patriotism in America's Schools, and Among School Teachers, Community Autonomy and Ideology in Teachers' Work. And he regularly contributes to newspapers and magazines, including The Washington Post, The Globe and Mail, The National Post, and The Toronto Star. He lives in Ottawa, where in winter he ice skates to and from work. We meet Dr. Melinda Smith. Dr. Melinda Smith is Vice Provost, Associate Vice President, Research in Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and Professor of Political Science at the University of Calgary. She has a research background in political science and criminal justice. Dr. Melinda Smith holds multiple awards, including, but nowhere near limited to, a Compelling Calgarians Award, 100 Accomplished Black Women Honoree, Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Fellowship, and an HSBC Community Contributor of the Year Award. Some of her co-authored and co-edited books include States of Race, Critical Race Feminism for the 21st Century, The Equity Myth, Racialization and Indigeneity at Canadian Universities, and Nuances of Blackness in the Canadian Academy, Teaching, Learning, and Researching While Black. This panel is being moderated by none other than Nala Ayad and recorded for CBC Ideas. I guess she just needs no introduction. I'm joking. Nala Ayad is the host of CBC Ideas and an award-winning veteran of foreign reporting. She is a graduate of Carleton University's Master of Journalism program and has an interdisciplinary background in philosophy, English, science, and genetics. Among her many awards and distinctions are a Prix Italia, a UK Foreign Press Association Story of the Year Award, a Canadian Association for Journalists Press Photojournalism Award, and a Canadian Association for Journalism Award for Human Rights Reporting. Nala Ayad holds 3 honorary doctorates from Concordia University, the University of Alberta, and the University of Manitoba. Her book, 1,000 Farewells, was a Governor General Literary Award finalist. That's Nala Ayad. So thank you so much for your presence and your participation this evening. After the moderated panel by Nala Ayad, there will be a Q&A where we hope that you will ask questions and participate, as this is such an important part of the symposium that Dr. Marc Spooner has planned. And then after the Q&A, there will be a reception there'll be a cash bar at the reception, and it's hosted by the University of Regina Alumni Association. So thank you so much again for your presence and participation, and we hope you have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introductions, very generous introductions. And thank you all for being here tonight. Huge thank you to all of you for being here tonight. And thank you to Marc Spooner for inviting us to be here. It's an honor to be here to have a very important discussion. And when I say we, I do mean we. There's myself, and there's also in the audience Dr. Melissa Gismondi, who is producing this segment for us, and who actually got us on to this, the importance of this conversation with a documentary she did for Ideas back in 2021 called The University Crisis. And the amount of engagement we had after that story was more than any other topic that we've covered at Ideas, which really gave us a sense of how live this conversation is in our homes, on our campuses, on our streets. So we're delighted to be back here today to pick up the conversation and to be with you today to do that. That's as much as you're going to hear from me. This is about the panelists, and after that, as was mentioned, there will be questions afterwards. I'd like to begin with a statement from each of you, please, on the question that we're tackling here today. And Melinda, if you don't mind, I'd love to start with you. The central question of this week, and this particular panel as well, is what are universities for? So let me ask every one of you for a short statement. What is the first thing that comes to your mind when I ask you what universities are for?
The first thing.
Yes.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I want to acknowledge the people of the Treaty 4 region. The first thing that comes to mind is the universities as spaces of imagination and possibilities. And what that has meant over time and space has varied. But it's a place of lifelong learning, a place where we can identify and tackle some of the great problems of our time, great wicked social problems. Given we are in a moment of coming out of a pandemic, a moment of great social transformation and social polarization, that necessarily means thinking through challenges of colonialism, enduring challenges of racism, challenges of racial polarization, economic poverty and inequality. And I think, so universities are spaces where we tackle these great problems and challenges, and we do so through, for all students of all backgrounds, we do it through teaching and learning, through research and inquiry, artistic inquiry, we do it through fueling ingenuity and creativity, we do it through innovation, trying to enhance the quality of life, trying to enhance the public good, trying to enhance citizenship and belonging. So I think universities have an extraordinary place in our society, in our world, and there's no other institution like them that can meet these challenges of today.
Thank you very much, Melinda. We'll jump to Jonathan next. If you can hear me all right?
Hear you fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure to see you all, even if it's via Zoom, which I don't prefer, but here I am. So I would respond to your inquiry in saying basically that there are three basic functions for universities today, and they are the discovery and the dissemination of knowledge, and that includes our first commitment to teaching and to teaching the new generation of our citizens. It is also for producing research discoveries that will change all of our lives. Very many people do not really appreciate the kinds of discoveries that have come from research universities, and I'd be happy to elicit, to produce a whole handful of them if you would like. And then third, I think it's building this, universities are for building citizens with a sense of civic responsibility and the values that we associate with civil societies. A university should also be, and it comes to mind immediately, a place for criticism, a home for criticism of various social practices and of social arrangements. Those who are critics must be protected by the university and by the population of their countries, especially from various forms of political external attacks. It is also a place that should instill in students, as our first speaker said, a desire for lifelong learning and an appreciation for the arts and sciences and issues of morality, ethics, empathy, and those values we associate indeed with civil society. I could go on, but maybe I will leave to later in our conversation some specifics about how the university's role and what it's for has evolved over time since its inception, at least in the United States in 1636 with the founding of Harvard College. Societies have evolved, universities have evolved with them. So what a university is for today is not the same that it was a century ago or 2 centuries ago. Mm-hmm. And I dare say that it will not be and should not be what it is today, 50 or 70 years from now. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much. And we will be coming back to all of as many of these ideas as we can in the time that we have. So that's just the start. Linda, if I could ask you to tackle the question, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when I ask you what are universities for?
Well, firstly, greetings everyone, and let me acknowledge that I'm visiting Treaty 4 territory and the peoples of this land from New Zealand, so I'm a little bit jet-lagged. It depends who asks the question and the tone of voice. If I imagine my mother, she would have said, "And what are universities for?" I think universities have multiple purposes that are layered over the years. And I agree with the previous speakers in terms of the high order aspirations and visions of what universities represent and try to represent. But also know universities have been places where for hundreds of years they were men's places. They were the places of white men. They were the places of imperialism and colonialism. And while I'd like to think that those years have gone, those centuries have passed, one of the interesting things about universities is they're not good at letting go of some ideas. They're not good at letting in necessarily new, noisy, radical ideas. That at one level they are about change, but at another level they're about the status quo. I find them very contradictory institutions. And for me, as a native person, a Māori from New Zealand, I've spent my career in universities, at war with the university, enjoying the privilege of the university, and trying to change the university so that it works better for the communities that I come from, and that it includes our knowledge and our language and our people, and that it starts to dismantle some of the knowledge forms and ideas that have framed both the way many disciplines still operate, the language of those disciplines, and the way they have sort of created others, the other, the category of the other. So, yeah, it's a contradictory place. At its best, I had a lot of fun. I had great colleagues, great students, and yes, it was about ideas in the mind. But I've also met really emotionally stunted people in universities because it's not necessarily holistic in the way we educate people.
Thank you very much, Linda. Joel, I'm going to experiment a bit here and ask you a slightly different question, but I think your answer will still work. What is the primary role that universities should play in a healthy democracy?
I was going to say, Nala, that you know what professors love to do when asked a direct question. They reframe the question. So you've reframed the question for me, and that's what I do want to speak to, is what are universities for in a democratic society? And I'll tell you the reason I'm saying that. Because if you think about universities around the world, in a totalitarian dictatorship, in a religious theocracy, in any form of government around the world, in a democracy, there's going to be some things in common in all those places. All those countries want students to learn mathematics, maybe a foreign language, maybe history. So that makes me think, what should be different in universities in a democratic society than those in, say, a totalitarian dictatorship? And I have some ideas about that, and I think we'll be talking about that tonight. But I will say, first of all, that democratic societies have different requirements of their citizens than other forms of government. In democratic societies, we need citizens who actively participate in civic life and who are informed about policies and can make decisions about those policies and weigh in with opinions. We need students who think critically, who ask tough questions about social policies of significance, and who can deal with multiple perspectives. We need those students because we need them to be citizens in a democracy, and that's what democracy requires. The philosopher John Dewey said that democracy must be born anew with every generation, and education is its midwife. That's, I think, the primary goal of universities, to be democracy's midwife.
I guess the first question that comes to mind listening to you, Joel, but I will put the question to the others, is this ideal of a university promoting and providing this education that allows us to be productive members of a democratic society. How did universities achieve that aim in the past? Melinda?
Well, I'll begin by saying universities didn't start that way. And in fact, many universities were birthed during colonialism. They were birthed in the context of segregation and apartheid, women weren't allowed to attend, or they were birthed for a particular religious order. And so I think universities historically and today continue to try to be more inclusive to spaces for more and more people in order to enable a more robust and inclusive democracy. And so, but that's always, going back to Linda's point, that's always contentious, right? Because it's contradictory. We want to maintain the status quo. We want to conserve and talk about our traditions. On the other hand, those who are trying to change things, transform things, contest the prevailing order. The unruly folks are seen, well, we can get into the language of wokeism, but but they are seen and disparaged. So universities are always contradictory spaces and contested spaces of learning and unlearning, but that's also healthy for democracy.
Joel, can you come back to you and just talk about briefly when it does work, how does it work? What does it look like?
I think when it's working, universities look like the free exchange, even when it's contentious, of ideas. We see multiple perspectives being expressed, and we see arguments and debates, because it's important for students and for all of us to know that well-meaning people differ on ideas of significance, right? That we can differ and still move forward with making decisions about self-governance. When we see universities work, we see students engage not only in their academics, but in the community and bringing community life back to their academics and going back and forth. We see students engaging with each other and forming relationships that are meaningful, because community is a large part of what strengthens democratic societies. So I think all of those things are what we see when we see a healthy university.
Yeah. Linda, I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on your opening statement. When we look at what universities might have done in the past and are doing today to promote democracy and civic participation, who did that, I guess, ideal version serve?
Good question. I mean, the simple, easy answer, those who had power anyway. But if we come, say, past the Second World War, I think universities did move into greater participation, which, many of the old guard thought was a terrible mistake, to democratize universities, and the criticism was it was a massification of universities, that the curriculum was going to go to hell, standards were going to lower, because that's not what a university should be. It should be much more elite, for the very best, to promote excellence of ideas, excellence of research. And so these ideas change over time, but they're still present. I'm sure those of you at faculty have had arguments about what is excellence. I'm sure students who are sitting their assessments are wondering, what is excellence? How do I get it? This striving for an idea, I think, is one of the best things that you find in a thriving place. It's because everyone is arguing it, talking about it, it's transparent. Sometimes those arguments are heated, but contained within rules of argument. There are rules of argument, and what we learn in a university are those rules and codes, as well as the content for arguing, for scholarship, for research.
Jonathan, if we accept the notion that universities have a role to play in a democracy and perpetuating democracy, have they kept up? How would you characterize how well they have kept up with the change in today's, let's say, Western democracies?
Well, I think strangely enough, they've always been leaders, and they've also simultaneously been followers. I think the leadership comes, frankly, in the areas of research, which is very rarely talked about when we think about American or, I dare say, Canadian universities. And the way in which that research, for example, has been responsible for about 70% of the productivity growth in the United States over the years. But they have not been inclusive, obviously, as we know, in terms of representing the full talents as well as demographics of our population. For example, 1911 or 12, the Harvard freshman class had 26% of its student body who were Jewish. And President Lowell said, we cannot have that. We can't have the hoi polloi mixing up with the Harvard elite. And so he said, went to the Harvard faculty and he said, well, I'd like to set a quota of about 6% for Jews. The faculty voted him down. So he went and he helped create the College Board, which produced a test which produced the results he wanted. That is to say, he would have examination questions which would take the form of, what is a universal joint? Now, the Jews from the Lower East Side didn't know what a universal joint was as part of a car, but certainly the kids from the Midwest who were not Jewish had a better chance of getting that answer correctly. And before you knew it, you had 6% of the student body being Jewish, and that was maintained until 1960. When I was a freshman at Columbia College in 1960, there were 2 people of color in my class, 2 out of 600 and some odd. Those things have changed gradually with social policies and the will of the colleges, but they still lag behind in many, many ways, especially those who come from economically poor backgrounds who also happen to be people of color. So the university, it seems to me, have got to find new ways of admitting students, be more inclusive rather than exclusive. Why should Columbia pride itself on rejecting 95% of the students who apply? Is that something to be proud of? When you know that probably 20 or 30% of the applicants could certainly do the work at Columbia, well, why don't we change our idea of what a meritocracy is? So there's always sort of a forward movement and a lag. And I agree with other panelists who say that universities are fundamentally conservative. Everyone thinks of them as radical places, but they really are fundamentally conservative. And we have to overcome that conservatism. And I think that we're in the middle of another phase of evolution, and then I'll stop, that is going to take us to a different place in 30 or 40 years.
Melinda, universities are fundamentally conservative.
You know, they are. Universities, there's this great mythology out there that universities are liberals or professors are liberals. Yes, some of them are. But universities also operate and think about traditions and standards. And the way that gets defined is very conserving. And so you see, I think this is one of the big contestations in universities of our time. My co-authors and I, we discussed it in the equity myth, the idea that university professors are liberal, and yet institutions remain fundamentally, at least the professoriate and leadership remain fundamentally white. There's a discussion about the curriculum. We're supposed to be a radically racialized, gendered society, but we actually aren't. There's gatekeeping and exclusionary practices to ensure there is little change. That's about conserving the status quo in terms of entry, in terms of the idea of what constitutes the meritocracy, in terms of ideas of what constitutes the curriculum. Rather than a pluri-university or a de-colonial curriculum, we want to maintain a particular vision of curriculum. So these are contested ideas. I think our universities, the free inquiry, autonomy, are needed more now than at any point in decades to contest those who would limit our ability to have a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive and decolonial campus, curriculum, and research agenda as well. So No, universities aren't radical and they aren't liberal. They reflect the broader society in which they operate. So that often is very conserving of the status quo.
We'll come back to the debate over where precisely, I mean, to make such a broad statement, it's difficult.
Yeah.
But I do want to kind of bring it back to the idea, Joel, of universities being these places that are supposed to improve the health of our democracy. If universities were to focus more on civic-minded education, which I'm assuming you're advocating, all of you are, who should be paying for that?
It's a public good.
Yeah, it's a basic public good, right? First of all, even broader than that, the idea, we've reframed universities now, I'm sure we'll talk about this, as job training institutions. Yes. And that's a very individualized view of the function of a university. It's an emaciated view of the historic ideal of a university. Sure, there's no one who doesn't want kids to be able to find meaningful work after university, but that's just where it begins. Universities have a role to play towards the public good because it's not just that each of us wants an education, we all have a stake in living in an educated society. And so we don't even have to talk about the civic goals of university. The fact is that a democratic society, really any society, requires or is more robust and is better if people are educated. And so it's a public good. So who pays for it? I think we should all pay for it, the public. It's one of the best investments we can make. And even on the playing field of investment return, there's tons of research that shows that a better education results in better health outcomes, in a million things that we otherwise have to pay for down the line. So even on those terms, which I don't really agree with, but even on those terms, it's a good investment and it's an excellent return.
Linda, go ahead. Did you want to address that as well, Linda, your thoughts on that? Who should be?
I have a 20-year-old grandson who's just dropped out of university. Disengaged from university, has come to live with us as grandparents while we carefully, sensitively try and help him reset what he wants to do. He doesn't really believe in the university in the way that we did. He doesn't find anything exciting. And when we talked about a career and a job, he's not afraid of hard work, he will work hard. But he doesn't see at the moment that the university is a pathway to that. So it's kind of interesting for us because his grandfather and I are both academics. His great-grandfather is also a scholar. And so here we have this grandson that we don't quite know how to speak to, because we've taken it for granted that this is the pathway to a life, to happiness, to good health, to being able to look after your family, your future grandchildren, our descendants, which in our culture is really important. So he's not buying into any of that at the moment, which is an interesting challenge, I think. And I know it's not just my grandson. I think there's a generation who are in their 20s, who've just come through COVID, who maybe are not sold on the idea of a university.
Yeah, we got a bit of that feedback as well with the documentary that Melissa did, and I wanted to read actually one of the comments, not to sort of pile on in this idea, but I think it's worthy of discussion. This one person wrote in saying, "We do our kids a huge disservice by pushing them to go to university when it won't improve their employability." And he goes on to say, "People with degrees are a dime a dozen these days." Jonathan, what goes through your mind when you hear that kind of commentary, by the way, from someone who actually did attend university and got a degree?
Well, I just think that that's misinformation, unfortunately. The facts are very clear, and studies have shown, and I'm not talking about just any studies, good, reputable, peer-reviewed studies have shown that there is a very significant payoff to a college degree. Over a lifetime, probably $1 million in excess of those who don't complete college. So in a purely monetary sense, there is a payoff, but I think that the payoff also has to be viewed in other terms, and we have to get our students to realize that they should pursue their passions, and that their actual passions, as developed, lead to good jobs. There are data from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences on the humanities, for example, which supposedly are going through a dreadful time. Well, it turns out that they're not as dreadful as one might think. First of all, the jobs that majors in humanities, and we shouldn't really be talking about majors, but people who take humanities courses, but nonetheless, the jobs they get are less than engineers. But after 10 years, that gap is closed, and the satisfaction with their lives is every bit as high as in any other field, any other domain. Mm-hmm. So I think that one of the things we have to do is educate the public. And the problem that we have is universities are very bad ambassadors for themselves. And they almost pride themselves at never advertising themselves. And I don't mean at football games. I mean at, in the way in which they are needed to achieve certain kinds of ends. If you look in the United States, and of course, I'm sorry that I'm not as well versed in Canada, and I am more actually in European universities, but in the United States today, I mean, young people are grappling with and are interested in global climate change. They are interested in the women's right to control their own bodies as it relates to their own health and other health-related issues. Obviously, abortion is one of them. There are a slew of the inequality of wealth, for example, and how to tackle that, and the consequences of inequality of wealth, and the prejudices and discrimination that still exists for segments of our population, particularly the people of color.
Yes.
We have to, I know you want, I will stop in 1 second, but we have to, that's what education is for. It's to educate a new generation of people who will understand these issues better and who can also convey them to other people in the public.
Melinda, you wanted to,
Yeah.
you wanted to respond.
This is so important, and also speaks to the paradox of the moment and the spaces we are in. Young people are amazing, and they are interested in these kinds of large social questions and they are about the public good. They are about societal good. They are about transforming things. And if they are not interested in university, we have to beg the question: a university seen as the spaces of imagination and possibilities that we used to see them as. And so my view is, if we are talking about more and more narrow kinds of things, that's not going to attract the breadth and diversity of young people that we need to actually fuel the kind of ingenuity and the creativity and the innovation that's necessary. So we need to be able to captivate the imaginations of young people. Coming out of the pandemic, the pandemials who finish high school in a pandemic, who are thinking they don't want to go into that again, we need to step up in terms of making the universities a more attractive place for more people. But there's an upside to it that we also don't emphasize. The diversity of young people, the knowledges they bring, the experiences they bring, that's a kind of incubator itself for social change and transformation, and I don't think we're tapping into it. So we must do more to make our universities relevant for the public good.
It's hard not to have this, or it's hard to have this conversation without bringing in kind of the elephant in the room, which is the fact that many students go to university purely to try to get a specific job. that they see a university as a training ground for a profession, for that kind of thing. So given that you're talking about wanting to fuel imagination and capture people's, young people's imagination, I wonder how you feel about that as educators, knowing that. Maybe Joel and then Linda.
Well, first of all, I think that it's true that universities are terrible ambassadors. I like that phrase. And so, unfortunately, the result of that means that all of us have to not only be concerned about public education, but educating the public. And it's also important to recognize that what you just raised is that, a lot of kids want to go just to train for their career, just to get the skills they need. But that's a two-way street. We've kind of lost the discourse of talking about universities as anything else other than job training institutions. So we have to create that language and create that space where students feel free to explore the things that they care about, to develop their own passions.
Where did that breakdown happen? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, we could talk about broader neoliberal ideology. I don't think that it's only at the university level. Every institution in our society is now subject to talk of standards and accountability and bean counting and value added, and we lose a lot there. I mean, we are living, the post-pandemic kids, and even before the pandemic, are experiencing an unprecedented level of loneliness and alienation. And so I don't think there's anything more important than bringing young people into a community of ideas and of creative expression where they can become the best version of themselves. And that's the language that we need to get out there so that students understand what universities can be about for them, in addition to preparing them to find meaningful work.
Linda.
I think we have a big problem with undergraduate education. I think it's a sausage machine, which is disciplining in particular ways, funneling in particular ways, and the idea of a good Bachelor of Arts or a liberal education at that undergraduate level is kind of been diminished. And the issues that young people are concerned about, they're not being taught that in their undergraduate curriculum often. They're being taught old crap. It's like, you've got to learn this before you learn that. You've got to learn to do this before you're allowed to do that. And I think both pedagogically and in our curriculum, we have not been ahead of where our students are. We are behind where the generation currently is. We haven't anticipated them. We haven't prepared for their aspirations. We keep telling them this is the way that you will eventually learn, and you will do it in a sequence, and you will do level 100 things first, and they want to do level 100, 300, 200, and a couple of things over there on the side. They don't want to specialise, and yet they've been funneled through high schools often into specialisms that take them away from some of the actual things that they will find valuable in life. Many of those students who are coming through straight out academic tracks never get to experience other fun things that you can do in society. And so when we have young people who are alienated from each other, but are in an institution with thousands of other people, we have a problem.
Yeah.
And it's, at one level, a common sense problem. And at another level, it's a really complicated problem. But I think it is about fundamentally our undergraduate provisions, the pedagogies that we use. I'm so glad that there's now technology called chatbox that can write essays, because hopefully it'll change assessment strategies. And it'll encourage other forms of dialogue in classrooms, and it'll stop classrooms having 600 students in them.
Yeah.
So, I think we do need to rethink some of the foundational curriculum that might have served my generation well, but I'm not sure if it's going to serve the next generation well.
We don't have a student on this panel because this is this kind of discussion, but I know there are students out there who will stand up and ask questions later, so we're counting on you to come and continue the discussion from your perspective. But I am curious, kind of to follow up on what Linda said, what students are telling you they need from a university education? What are you hearing from the students that come to you looking for, hey, this isn't working for me? What are they saying? Maybe Jonathan and whoever else wants to tackle the question.
Well, I think they are so funneled into, their various niches that they say rather little. They're just waiting to get into the next, the next level. I think that to follow on Linda's very good point, I think there are a number of things that are evolving in universities that we need to extend. First of all, an education without borders. We have organized our universities by disciplines and digging deeply into disciplines. And there was a time for that, and there was an extremely important period where the depth of our knowledge was needed, and it was extremely constructive. But now it's become a constraint. It's a fetter on what people actually learn. And we don't allow students or faculty, for the most part, to roam the university and to use all of its assets. So that's one thing that I think we should do. The second thing that I think we need to do is we have to get rid of the current idea and definition of meritocracy. Meritocracy is essentially today being able to score well on SAT exams that will turn you into a Wall Street lawyer. And that is a form of intelligence. There is no question that the people who score well on those tests will do well in society at a certain level. But it excludes so many people with so much talent that are not being attracted to the university, who are not being listened to, who are being misdefined as lacking creativity and lacking ability, that we have to turn to another metric, a new way of thinking about admissions and encouragement of undergraduates, even if they wind up in graduate school by the time they finish their 4 years as undergraduates.
Joel, you wanted to pick up on that?
Yeah, we already brought up one elephant in the room. I would like to squeeze another elephant in. I think by the end of the evening, we're going to have a menagerie of elephants. But the elephant I want to talk about is funding. Yeah. Because you asked, what do students want? Mm-hmm. And the problem is that students don't have the space to want other things other than to get in, get out quickly, and get a job. And the reason is because they're saddled with enormous amount of debt when they leave university, and many cannot even afford to go to university in the first place. I have a radically increased number of students who are working full-time while they're in school.
Just to make ends meet.
Just to make ends meet. Yeah. That's not a university education. So the funding issue, I think, is it kind of lulls over all of this and prevents students from being able to tell us what they want or even to know what they want because this is so claustrophobic for them.
Melinda.
Yeah, I think when funding is huge, along with the fees, along with debt and concern about debt, and then also in terms of employability. So these things, the combination of these things, I think, constrain the imagination and possibilities about what people want to do. But if you look at what students are actually engaged in, the movements they are engaged in, the change they're trying to bring into the world, whether it's around the ecological crisis, whether it's around reproductive rights and freedoms, whether it's around dealing with the big social wicked problems of our time, including social polarization, including the racial reckoning, gender justice, indigenous concerns, about big issues around water. This is what students are concerned about. This takes time to be in a university and to reflect, and yet the fee structure, the funding structure don't enable it. I also want to talk about research funding, because research funding is tailored to narrower and narrower domains, which means then that's not accessible to as many people as it should be. So we do need to think about the ways in which the funding does not enable education for the public good.
But is it as simple as, increasing funding to universities would actually somehow revert them to their, idealistic goal of being, of providing education for the sake of education? Is it that simple?
It's the question is, do you want an enabling environment that enables discovery, that enables ingenuity and creativity? We don't know where they will take us, but it may require risk-taking. It may require us doing things differently. And as long as we are so narrowly constrained by we need to a specific kind of education to get a specific kind of job in quickly, the imagination crashes on us. Mm-hmm. So I do think funding shapes the idea of possibilities unduly.
If universities don't prioritize job training and links with business and corporate enterprises, are we at the stage now where they risk becoming irrelevant?
They always risk becoming irrelevant, and for many people they are irrelevant. It's a really difficult sort of measure, I think, for universities, because relevancy is not simply about whether graduates can get jobs. There are many people who, in my communities, that go, "What are you teaching up there? You're teaching them to be activists." I'm going, yes, that's relevant. We will always need activists, we will need teachers, we will need thinkers, we will need artists, we will need musicians, we will need people who think out of the box. We need many kinds of people to be a rich society, rich not just in money in terms of wealth, but rich in terms of our diversity, our ability to sustain ourselves, to be interesting. But also to look after the earth that we are in and our places. So, I think, universities are tricky places. They are relevant over the long term, often, but are often irrelevant in the 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Say that the universities will continue to be and are extremely relevant for the society. It's in fact critical. And for one aspect of it, if nothing else, and that is the research that is done and the teaching that is done at the graduate level. We tend to focus on undergraduates, and it's of course understandable that we do. That's what most of us think about. But the fact of the matter is that if you look at what universities have produced in the last 100 years by way of discoveries that have altered the lives of people all over the world, from vaccine discoveries, from the laser, from the technology which we're using right now on this program, and much more in the way of biomedical research and the like, that's hardly irrelevant. That is extraordinarily relevant, and getting young people to that point makes it even more relevant. But we can do much more at the undergraduate level, I agree.
Jonathan, let me stay with you, because this is kind of what I was trying to get at. In discussions leading up to this conversation, people pointed out things like the Google Career Certificate Program, which costs, I believe, $39 a month to enroll in. And so when I talk about irrelevance, I'm curious whether you think these kinds of job training programs might one day usurp the university's role in preparing, at least for certain kinds of jobs in society.
Well, they may, depending on how good they are. But let's just take the question the questions surrounding AI, artificial intelligence, or CRISPR technology. That is not simply a matter of technique. That is not a matter of simply learning how to code. There are ethical and moral and institutional questions that are fundamental to our democracy about what the perverse effects might be of some of these technologies and whether we want to go down those lanes, whether we can stop it. So the university is a place where you can mix historians, philosophers, social scientists with scientists to debate these kinds of questions that is not going to be found at Google.
Please, go ahead, Melinda.
I think we're emphasizing a number of things. Universities are spaces of sociality where people from all backgrounds and walks of life come together, and there's no other spaces like that. For the classrooms are spaces of learning for critical thinking, curiosity. There's the areas of research that require transdisciplinarity. I mean, I think we underestimate or undersell or undershare these the university as a spaces of possibilities to our peril. We simply do not do enough to talk about this. And so it's not just about training for a job. It's training to be better human beings, training to be better parents and friends, training to be better citizens. But the very democracies that enable our universities require us to have this kind of critical thinking, curiosity. But also, if you think about some of the challenges of misinformation, anti-science, vaccine denial, these kinds of issues require an educated citizenry who have the ability and the skills to raise questions about questionable kinds of things. And universities are the places where this kind of education happens.
So
Can I just add
Yeah,
one
please.
quick thing, is that all of that makes a ton of sense. And some of the places where that happens, and I'm sure all of us have had these experiences in our own university experiences, is not actually in the particular classes. So you would lose this with a Google education because much of our education takes place in the in-between spaces, during breaks in class, during all-night discussions about philosophy or science or anything else. And that type of education is the kind of education that binds us to one another, that increases our sociality, as you said.
So in an environment where it appears as though there's more focus on job training, this is a very broad question, but I'm looking for any sense of a practical answer, which is how can universities strike a balance between being a place that can provide job training, but also providing an education for all these other wonderful reasons that all of you have brought up. So
The remarkable thing about all of this is all of us with education have some employment. And there is no direct correlation between the education we have necessarily and the kind of employment we have or the changes we have made over time and space. So one of the challenges we face is, yes, education is for the public good, and part of the public good is making sure that people have good income, good jobs, but that adaptability and curiosity and flexibility also means that if they have to change jobs, they're adaptable and able to do so. So I think what we are resisting is not that universities don't enable people to get jobs and good paying jobs to reduce poverty and inequality and to enable social mobility. What we are resisting is the idea that there's a direct correlation between this education and that job, and that's going to be enough over a lifetime. So I think that the more and more narrow push of funders or governments of the day towards this or this type of university misunderstands what they think they understand what the economy needs, what society needs, what ingenuity needs. But that's only in a moment. We don't know what 10 years, we want the job for the future. That requires us to be adaptable. You want the job for tomorrow. What does that look like? And they're asking us for the job for, the next day. And so I think, so I do think jobs are important, good paying jobs are important, but not the narrow correlation that is drawn at the moment.
But how do you... I'll come to you in a minute, Jonathan. I'll go to Joel and then Linda and then Jonathan, if that's okay. Thank you.
I just want to add to that the university's role as job training, and the word training is very important there. Universities have always had the role of giving students the knowledge, skills, and attitudes they need to succeed in the workplace in various forms, in various jobs. Training was the purview of the business. They pay you while they're training you for their specific job, and that's what corporations did. They have done a magical act to their benefit of downloading all of that training onto the university. And not only does that benefit them, but it makes no sense to the student because of exactly what you said, that they might be in a different job later on, right? And they should expect and have the right to be trained by that job. So the fact that we're saddled with this idea of job training is the problem in the first place.
Right. Linda,
Well, I think it's important for universities to protect the role of humanities, social sciences, those fields and disciplines that actually don't necessarily, or people don't see a job at the end of that particular major or that particular subject. But in the long run, over time, you know, graduates out of those programs end up all over the place. And I don't know what you graduated in or what you graduated in, but, you know, many of my colleagues have moved over time over many different fields that we're way beyond where we might have done our PhDs.
I graduated in electrical engineering and computer science.
So there we go.
It was a well-kept secret until now.
Yeah, and
Yep.
I mean, you know, we did try and tell our grandson, it doesn't matter what degree you do. We don't worry. He was on an engineering path, but he loves cooking. He loves reading. He loves history. But that's not what a secondary school prepared him for.
Yeah.
They prepared him for maths and physics, which he's good at, but that's not his passion. And so he's kind of trapped having to restart into something new. To me, universities have very powerful professional schools that are often seen as the engine room of the university, that drive income because they also attract research funding. And then you have other elements of the university, perhaps in the arts and in music, that are not seen as wealth producers. So I think there's a system at play that it is connected to the funding of students, it's connected to the funding of staff and faculty members, it's connected to the way the university is funded, the way research systems are funded, that keeps everyone in this loop, in this hegemony, that universities are somehow linked directly to jobs and to employment. And yet, you know, that's a particular kind of system. Mm-hmm. It works some of the time in that instrumental way. What Jonathan said, I agree, the stats at home are really clear. You get a university degree in anything, your income over time will be higher than those who don't have university degrees. Does it mean now that young people can afford to buy a home? No, because their student loans are humongous. My generation didn't have student loans. So there's a whole lot of inequities in the system that I think make it really challenging for this generation and the next 2 generations, I think, coming through.
thank you, Jonathan. Please go ahead and before we move on to another part of the discussion.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I want to build on what Linda has just said. First of all, I would say that universities do prepare people for jobs. That is to say, that's the nature of professional schools. The trouble is that also that much of that training in, let's say, a school like social work is underfunded, and when they get out, they get lower paying jobs, so they have higher debt. So it does come back to the issue of money and debt to some extent and how well those schools are funded. But if you get a law degree from Columbia, believe me, you're going to be pretty well set in the job market, almost for sure, as is true at the business school and medicine. So there is a tremendous amount of job training, but it doesn't happen and doesn't have to necessarily happen at the undergraduate level. In fact, an emphasis on the arts and sciences seems to me the best preparation for making choices about where you want to go professionally.
Thank you very much for that. I want to, in the little time that we have left, kind of broaden the conversation a little bit about what the responsibility of universities are to the public at large. And we've sort of touched on it a little bit at the beginning of the conversation. And I want to harken back a little bit to something that Jonathan mentioned early on is what do you think universities have gotten wrong about their role as a public institution? Melinda, I thought maybe you could tackle that.
We forgot the public. So, I think we are part of the societies and communities in which we live. We are members of the communities, and the communities expect their children and grandchildren to come to these institutions. I think now you see universities returning to this idea of more community engagement, more service learning to try to connect the community. But we're having to do it in a structured way because we were disconnected. We forgot the civic purpose of education. So I actually think we need, and I would also say, paradoxically, we were cutting or disappearing the very programs that connected us to this idea of the public civic engagement, university, whether the social sciences and humanities, the creative arts, creative inquiry. So if this connects to the prior question about the kind of technical professionalization of the university at the expense of this larger piece. So we are connected to industries and the professions, terrific. We now are just trying to reconnect in a much more meaningful way to the communities we are with. And I think that's actually a good thing. But that the university also, I'll just make this point quickly here, we are in the midst of a great social transformation, great polarization. I mean, that's another elephant in the room, great polarization. We don't just see it in the United States, we see it in Canada. The very disciplines that enable us to tackle these great wicked social problems are the ones that are under the most duress.
The liberal arts.
The liberal arts. Meaning then, we are diminishing our capacity to respond to one of the greatest social challenges we face. Social polarization, the need for pluralism in a way, how do we live well together? So I think connecting to communities will help us with this, will refocus the attention of institutions, but it's long overdue and we have a lot of work to do.
It is a very tough looking landscape out there. There is the polarization, there's the climate crisis, misinformation, disinformation, populist threats to democracy. So how, can we talk about what practically that looks like, how a university can help in, I don't know, at least making the conversations possible? When we can solve these problems.
I think one of the trends needs to be the opposite of where we're going. And of course, public education has to be about education for the public good. Right? And the public good requires some of the things that we've said, being able to deal with multiple perspectives, working on relationships between and among each other, reducing that kind of blind polarization. But for that to happen, classrooms, in the practical sense, which is what you asked, classrooms have to brim with the passion and creativity that we want to see in the society. But the reason we've gone in the opposite direction is because we're obsessed with standards and accountability. There's nothing wrong with standards. I mean, we all have standards. I've never met a professor who doesn't have standards and who doesn't feel accountable to the students and to the university and to the nation. The problem is with the word standardization, which literally means making everything the same. But universities are not McDonald's, and we don't want to Big Mac-icize all our classrooms, right? The things that make them brim with passion and creativity are local things, what local professors and students are passionate about and feel creative about. And when students are immersed in that kind of eclectic and unpredictable environment, that's when we get the real education for democratic citizenship and the real education that democracies need.
Linda, given the severity of these issues that we're talking about here, and also how much power universities have as public institutions, I mean, Melinda kind of answered this already, but is there any sense in which do you think that universities are failing the public?
I think the biggest contribution that universities make to the public good are the thousands of graduates each year that come out. Every year, every semester, graduates, postgraduate students, that's the sheer bulk of that is what we all take for granted. And yet every year, students have been trained in particular ways, have got critical thinking skills, have got qualifications, graduate out of the institution. So that's one layer of a public good. You know, another layer of the public good is probably the public good research that the public don't really know about. There's all the fancy medical, biomedical research, but there are faculty members who are researching in communities, who are working with, you know, those in society who have been marginalised and who are struggling. There are those who are working in careers, you know, that didn't exist 10 years ago, who are making new careers and new industries, really, new jobs. You know, so don't underestimate the sheer capacity of people that universities are producing in the public good. They are also the public. And then there's the, you know, the highly intense research that universities, and, you know, Jonathan mentioned that, that are, you know, there's the, in the context of COVID, I think in my country, we were grateful for the capacity of New Zealand scientists to protect us. Because in the world, you know, 2 years ago, the efforts that were made were in the Northern Hemisphere. And every country then had to think, who's going to look after us in our health system? We're not going to get it from England. It's not going to come from the US. They're looking after themselves. Who looks after us in New Zealand or in Australia or in the Pacific or in Asia? It's the capacity that we have to build in our own national contexts. And that capacity isn't just coming from our own universities. It's coming from a global system of universities in which graduates are flowing in and out, and that also enriches the publics across the globe. The skills that people bring and travel with, you know, that these qualifications travel. They're not just for Saskatchewan, they're not just for Canada. They have a global currency, and that matters. And it particularly mattered when the world shut down, because in some countries there was no capacity. And what it demonstrated is there's still this extraction and exploitation of parts of the world that are sucked up into the first world from the developing world. And we've just got to do more to keep that sort of circular knowledge and economy flowing. Those are part of the public good.
Thank you for that. Jonathan, do you want to add something before we move on?
Well, a couple of thoughts. I think there are many ways in which universities need to change, partly because of the failure of the current system, but more because of the evolution of the society in which they're located. First of all, I think that we have to begin to think, as Linda just pointed out at the end of her comments, of universities as global institutions. We have responsibilities not only to our own immediate constituencies, but to people in the continent of Africa, in Latin America, and in other places in the world who need education and will, because of technology, may not have the ideal situation of being in the classroom or in a seminar room, but that will be simulated. And we're going to have more pandemics if we don't attend to the education and treatment of people around the world. And I think our universities have fundamentally, up to this point, fallen short in that. I think we tend to focus, and I am guilty of this myself, on elites and elite universities, and we have overlooked the need of the public institutions, the large public institutions, and their fight and the tension that exists between government and universities. We are in the midst, at least in the United States, of attacks on universities' academic freedom and free inquiry, and we don't have the courageous leadership that is solidifying itself and coming together to really defend the university and its purposes against these would-be autocrats. Let me leave it at that and allow for questions. I could go on, but...
Okay. I do want to ask this question. The influential scholar and activist Cindy Blackstock has said that, quote, academia and activism should coexist. She says, don't just publish another paper, instead do something. What do you make of her idea? I'd love to hear from all of you on this briefly, if possible, starting with you, Melinda.
Cindy Blackstock is brilliant, and I think her knowledge as a professor of social work, and first at University of Alberta and now at McGill, but also her civic engagement, her public engagement around children, have showed how knowledge for the public good can be mobilized to change systems and structure. It also shows that one person or a few people with good ideas and determination can also lead to enormous transformation. I do think that with the standardization and professionalization, we did get into a situation where universities will publish or perish, just another journal article behind a paywall that nobody read. And yet there's now a democratization of publishing, open access publishing, but it's also, what is the purpose of this? What is the good of this? What does it change? How does it enable change and transformation? And so I agree that our knowledge must be mobilized for the public good, which is what Cindy is suggesting, but we have to also be producing citizens who are actively involved, not just in being good workers and making large amounts of money, but also in volunteerism, also in social change, also in creating a better society. We need to get them voting, we need to get them participating in civic life. And that, I think, is what a good public education should allow. I would also make another point quickly, is that it's not just about education. When we defend the public good, we're also defending public hospitals. We're also defending social security. We are also defending the whole infrastructure that is under duress. So this is really important. I think that that's an article that has sparked a lot of conversation and change, and it needs to.
Academia and activism coexisting.
I mean, how did activism get to be this bad word? Being active in gym class was a good thing. And being active anywhere is seen as a good thing. We turn it into a noun and suddenly it's this evil thing. Activism is about being active and being engaged. But I will say something from my particular perspective of universities in the service of democracy, is that along with the bad word of activism, we seem to have created this other bad word, which is political. Should universities be political? Of course they should be political, right? I mean, politics is the domain in which we are active, and politics are the way we come together to work out our differences. This political has become a bad word, but Bernard Crick, in his book In Defense of Politics, said that politics is the way people in a democratic society come together to work out their differences and move forward towards policy. We have to have students educated in the fact that being active is important, being political is important, and that their academic curriculum is tied to community and civic engagement.
Linda, let me read you one of the comments again from the piece that we did. Universities, this person says, universities were conceived as institutions of inquiry. Today they've become institutions of progressive advocacy. How do you address that statement?
Well, I would deconstruct it.
But not in an academic article.
No. I kind of agree and disagree, really, with the statement. I think it's hard to make, that kind of statement about the university when we've just finished saying that it's conservative and, supports the status quo. They're not necessarily the homes of progressive ideas in all spaces, nor do they necessarily produce activists in all areas. They produce people who are conservative, people who are liberal, people who are radical activists, a diverse array of people come out of universities. I think it's easy to take potshots at a university because of what a few scholars say, who happen to be in the public domain. I think it's easy to take potshots at students because students protest at certain things without really seeing, the whole of all the other students who may be concerned about other activities. I was a student activist in my day, and that was long time ago in the 1970s. It's driven my own personal career. I agree totally with Cindy and have tried to live a academic life as an activist in the Indigenous space, but I've also tried really hard to be a really good writer, a really great researcher, the best teacher I can be, the best administrator I can be, the best mentor I can be to the next generation. I don't see an academic life as a singular life. I see it as a very privileged life where we get to reinvent and invent ourselves all the time and to travel across the world of ideas and thoughts and to be able to think about things. I mean, I sit in airplanes and think, and then my daughter says, "What do you do?" Because she never wanted to be an academic, because she looked at her parents and thought, what are you? And that's her grandson, that's her son who's come to live with us. But for me, it's given me an opportunity to exercise particular influence in the world of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous rights, Indigenous communities, Indigenous research. And in that sense, it's an opportunity I'm not sure I would have had.
Jonathan, we have all heard the criticisms leveled against universities of being places where extreme wokeism is at play, that there's ideological uniformity. Is there any sense in which these criticisms are getting at something that might be true?
Well, I think there have been, patterns throughout history at universities of advocates for positions that have been try to forcefully advance those positions. The question is how is that discourse treated within the university? Is it a matter of discourse or is it a matter of fighting? Let me conclude my observations by, if you will, since I believe that there are many forms of doing something at a university, to quote from what I think is the greatest 3-page, but I'll only read you a short paragraph, statement on the principles of the university that were produced by the University of Chicago in the Calvin Committee report of 1968, which dealt with universities in times of crisis. And I hope that people will actually Google this, use Google, and look this up if they haven't seen it before. So I begin. The mission of the university is the discovery, improvement, and dissemination of knowledge. Its domain of inquiry and scrutiny includes all aspects and all values of society. A university faithful to its mission will provide enduring challenges to the social values, policies, practices, and institutions. By design and by effect, it is the institution which creates discontent with the existing social arrangements and proposes new ones. In brief, a good university like Socrates will be upsetting. The instrument of dissent and criticism is the individual faculty member or individual student. The university is the home and sponsor of critics. It is not itself the critic. And I think that all of us basically can play an active role, do something within that framework if we are defended by the university in terms of its fundamental values and principles, which I think are well articulated here.
Okay, thank you for that. I think to end off before we go to questions, I'd like to ask each of you the same question, and actually starting with you, Jonathan, because it's based on something, you've written a book about what the American university will look like 40 years from now. So perhaps I can begin with you and have each of you address this question. Can you each tell me one thing you'd like to see in the University of 2063, if we're all here, and one thing you'd like to see left behind? So Jonathan, maybe starting with you.
I would like to see a multidisciplinary, diverse culture that includes academic leagues, which combines the ideas and imaginations of people in multiple universities, offering opportunities to students and faculty members to discuss ideas, to develop ideas, and to disseminate those ideas for the public good. I would like it to become less elitist, less focused on the elite institutions, and more open to the discovery of practical knowledge that will serve local communities, nations, and the larger world that we live in.
Thank you, Jonathan. Linda.
I'd like to think that in the future, teachers are still human beings and you're not taught by machines, that students are human beings and are not machines, that classrooms are places of human interactions, that universities are places also of social interactions and not just learning. I would also like to imagine that the places that universities occupy, the environments that they occupy, are environments that are biologically diverse, that are sustainable, that enable learners, teachers, students to understand what it means to live in relation to the environment, to live respectfully on the lands, to live respectfully with the waters. I'd like to believe we can drink water from rivers, from waterways and from lakes. I'd like to believe that we can still grow our own food and that our supply chains of food are controlled by humans. I read a lot of science fiction. But I'm also involved in some AI research. So, you know, the world is changing in lots of different ways. But to me, universities are human places, social places, and I'd like to see that continue.
Thank you very much. Joel.
The educator Maxine Greene once said, "The purpose of education is to comfort the troubled and trouble the comfortable." And I think that's a wonderful sort of guiding schema for what I'd like to see in universities in the future. Of course, they have to be places where we comfort the troubled, where we welcome a diverse student body, where we keep them free from bullying, where they're allowed to make mistakes and fail and still have productive educations. But if we stop there, that's not enough. I think that we also need to teach students that there are problems in the world. We need to trouble the comfortable and tell them that not only are there problems in the world, but that they are the ones charged with participating in the idea of finding solutions to those problems.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And Melinda?
The future-focused university. I think I would, 40 years from now, I would like for the university, and no surprise to many in the room, to be more equitable, to be more diverse, inclusive, and decolonial space. So we have I also want to think of, rather than a university, think of a pluri-university, which is to say our societies are characterized by hyperdiversity. Diversity of people, but also of ideas. They're from different parts of the world. They also live in kind of very diverse and complex neighborhoods. But we talk about that as more as demographic change, or not in terms of the contributions, the pluri-knowledges that those people bring, and how that can be mobilized to generate whole new kinds of thinking and ingenuity, creativity, and imagination. So I'd rather go from just thinking of it as a thing, or diversity, to thinking about how we mobilize that for new ideas of the public good and more inclusive spaces. So, but that means that the university itself can't be a university. It has to be a pluri-university, where we welcome a diverse curriculum and diverse knowledges from around the world, and also where we have different ways of knowing and thinking and being. So that, to me, would be the university of the future. This also means then the university of the future has to get rid of this or the society of the future, this idea of bringing in this multiplicity to Canada, a brain gain, and then wasting that talent, but out-recognizing foreign credential, but out-recognizing foreign experiences. But the very idea of foreign needs to be troubled, because some foreign are welcome, and some foreign are marginalized and impoverished. So the University of the Future has to be better able, and Society of the Future has to be better able to turn this brain drain, because you're taking talent and wasting it, into a brain gain for the public good.
We've only just scratched the surface. I've learned so much. Thank you so much to each and every one of you for answering my questions. Now it's your turn. We have 2 microphones. One's over here, one's there. We ask that you keep your questions as short as possible, please, so we can get to as many of them as possible. So, especially the students out there, if you have a question, please line up at the microphone. And if not, I'll just keep asking my own. Okay, I think we have one right here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Thank you so very much for being here. I'm a late grad. I'm going to be 70 years old in July, and I graduated at 53. I'm one of those social workers who ended up working in CBOs. My question is scribbled here. Someone talked about people following their passion. What role should universities be playing in communities where systemic racism and poverty and addiction play with the lives of the young people every day? Everyone in the community, including mature adults. Too many young people who are brilliant and who love learning can never even imagine themselves as a substantial, meaningful addition to the university culture or to their community culture. So that's my first question, and hopefully my second question will get asked.
Thank you very much for that. Who would like to take that on? Melinda.
Thanks. I do think this question is so important and timely. We apparently came out of a moment of racial reckoning in 2020 after the death of George Floyd, but there were many instances in Canada like that. When I started in Calgary, I had the privilege of chairing 3 days of public hearing on racism. And one of the things that stays with me now is how many young people talked about being pushed out, talked about being policed, under surveillance, questioned, challenged, everything from what they said, how they sounded, to what they dressed like. That, to me, is also part of this critique I'm talking about, of a wasted talent. So systemic racism is a thing, yet we see denial, including from politicians, who characterize any effort to ameliorate racism as wokeism, which I think is nonsense on stilts, by the way. Sorry, that's Jeremy Bentham, I should cite. But so if we want these young people to be passionate about their lives and livelihood and contributing to the public good and imagining a world otherwise than one characterized by poverty and inequality and water we can't drink, we actually must attend to these great social wicked problems, which is why the liberal arts, humanities, social sciences are necessary now more than ever, and yet we are underfunding them in institutions. So these are real problems which must be addressed for the future of humanity.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. We're going to alternate the two sides, and
Okay.
I think I see someone standing there.
Yes, thank you. First of all, it's such a pleasure to be present tonight, and I'd like to thank all of you for your contributions. One of you, I can't recall who, earlier defined the university as a space of sociality. And Linda, if I may be so bold as to address you that way, in her concluding remarks there, talked about she hoped that we won't be taught by machines in the future. Unfortunately, there is a development that scares me to death, and that is what is called the asynchronous class. Synchronous class is where the students come together as they would at a certain time, and we can all see each other, even if it's on screen. But an asynchronous class is I post a bunch of resources, lectures, some of which I prepared several months ago, and the students download them and respond to them. And there's no exchange. They don't even know who is in the class. The sociality aspect is zero, and almost worse than zero. I wouldn't mind hearing your comments about the direction that that kind of thing is taking.
Thank you. Please go ahead.
Not good. I mean, and I think we're learning from students themselves, and from the issues, you know, as I know, as a faculty member, I've had to deal with in the last few years that I never had to deal with 20 years ago. For example, we're not trained as faculty members to deal with mental illness in our students, to be able to recognise that, nor in our colleagues. But over the last few years, you know, I can think of numerous incidents in which we were inadequately prepared. And there's a relationship between the way we teach and students. The whole point of learning is it is a relationship between learning and teaching, between teacher and learner. To me, that's a very powerful pedagogical idea. And the moment we start to kind of remove, that's what I was talking about, the humanness of that, I think we create other problems. It's not that the human mind can't learn in all these different ways, but we're not just training human minds. We're training people. And we're training people, educating people as they are developing as people. Most universities' undergraduates are young. I mean, I teach in an institution where they're not that young. And we get 4 years, 3 to 4 years, to help them prepare for life. And if what we do is teach an alienated kind of curriculum, then I think it'll have terrible consequences. And hopefully students rebel against that.
Thank you for the question and the answer. Please go ahead.
And thank you to all the panelists for your remarks. I'm a journalist and a professor. So for World Press Freedom Day today, I'd like to pose a question to Joel about sort of with these, I guess, illiberal attacks on journalists and on academics alike. What are universities for in terms of helping ensure a healthy media ecology, as civic institutions, but also, as significant publishers themselves? Is there some shared space for journalists and researchers?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think universities have an important role for that, and it really goes back to a lot of what we've discussed, because they have to be spaces of public exchange of ideas, and therefore they need to protect those who exchange ideas and who are the purveyors of many ideas. The only reason that universities shy away from that role when they do is a combination of cowardice, but also a succumbing to the role of the university simply as job training, right? That they've given up that role of protecting public debate. And so I absolutely think there's a huge role for universities to play, and they can play that role. And not only that, it's a pedagogical imperative, meaning that we have to model that for our students and for the way that students engage in public debate.
Great, thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for all the wonderful ideas we've already heard. Early on, there was a comment about the universities being constituted through liberal thinkers, and that we hope that professors were liberal in their thinking. And I'm just wondering if that is actually good enough in the way to consider the diversity that we have in our society and the diversity that we actually need in the universities right now. It seems to me that liberalism is actually taking too long. that we need something to act an awful lot more quickly than that. And liberalism may not be good enough anymore. And where and how can we make it the norm to actually be critical thinkers? To see that in a classroom, if there's not a diversity of students like there are in the society, that isn't good enough. And the same thing with the kinds of knowledge that is produced, not just the people that are there, but it seems to me that we do need the diversity of thinking to address many of the problems that have been named just in the last hour. So is it possible to hope that the university will be a more critical thinking place?
Who are you hoping would answer that question?
Jonathan.
Jonathan, please. Well done. Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you for choosing me. I really appreciate that. It's actually an extremely good question about whether or not the kind of social system and values that we have are good enough. My problem, at least in teaching at Columbia with Columbia students, which has become far more diverse, at least in terms of ethnic and racial characteristics, is not that there isn't space for them to discuss and describe from their own points of view and own backgrounds the questions that are raised in the classroom about all kinds of matters like inequality and issues of racial discrimination, etc. But the fear that seems to exist among students in expressing those views. And that's what concerns me, actually. What is there going on at the Columbia campus level or the societal level which makes a student think twice or pull their punches before they're willing to express what may be to them an unpopular view in the class? Some of us try to do an awful lot to expunge that fear, but I find that it is all too prevalent. I had a student, a wonderful, brilliant student who was of color and was gay, and he became kind of a friend who saw me in after class a lot. And I asked him what it was like to be black and to be gay at Columbia, and he said, "Well, when I'm in the company of white people, I talk white. When I'm in the company of black people, I talk black. That's not good enough." And that has to do with the culture and the social structure of our universities. And I dare say Columbia is not alone.
Thank you for a good question. And thanks for that, Jonathan. Please go ahead.
Hi, I'd like to direct this to the good doctor from Columbia. Who currently decides what universities are for?
Well, I think that's an extremely interesting question. I happen to think that it's partly tradition and it's partly the evolving society that offers context for change and the need for change, and the institution of universities fulfill that function in the society to a significant extent, especially in terms of innovation, new discoveries, new ideas, tackling various kinds of issues. But I have found that there was paradoxically, at least at Columbia and the schools that I'm very familiar with, which include many public universities, we have faculty members who are very much engaged in change and wanting to see an evolution in what the university is like. And then those other types that I was mentioning early are people who are very conservative and who want to replace the third Milton scholar in the English department with another Milton scholar. Not that I don't think everyone should read Milton, but why not replace him with a scholar who does African-American literature of the 20th century? And they think, what? Can we do without our third Milton scholar?
Yeah, that's so true.
And it's conservatism that I'm talking about that we have to overcome.
So I just want to point out that we have about 8 minutes left, and there's 5 of you here, or 6, I think. So if we can sort of cycle through the questions as quickly as possible, we can get you all in there. So please, over here.
First of all, I'm very proud of my alma mater for providing this opportunity for me to learn. Thank you. Secondly, I just recently read some university research that talked about negativity and the harm it does, and positivity and how it heals and grows. I'd hate to classify this discussion tonight on either one of those. Now, help me out. What can I do?
Anybody want to tackle that?
That's an impossible question because you don't have a clue who I am and what I do. But where do I go to get answers to that question?
Can you rephrase your question? Just tell me again what your question is.
I'm a retired 78-year-old person. I'm working on my end of life, but while I'm here, I want to do something good. Mm-hmm. And my alma mater is a good choice.
Okay. Do you have a response for that, Jonathan, maybe?
I think it's a tremendous virtue that your willingness to give the time that you have to a university. And there are many ways in which I think alumni can become active with students, helping students, depending upon their own backgrounds, can engage with the university in a variety of ways that interest them, and it can also continue to take courses. I mean, a great university should be prepared to offer knowledge to people regardless of their age and regardless in some ways of their backgrounds. And I would hope that your university provides something like that. It certainly will be one of the things that I think will change over the next 30 or 40 years. And we will be seeing universities educating teenagers to people who are your age and my age.
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you for repeating it. I didn't quite catch you the first time. Thanks a lot. On this side, please.
Thank you, and this is kind of along those same lines, because as we move into this weekend, I think we're all going to be searching for solutions. Just to maybe put a finer point on it, the panel has spoken about the issues of the systemic barrier to change, which is the meritocracy. And whether it be from a faculty perspective of having the publish or perish model, or our students in our classrooms that are, searching for as many A's as they can get to unsaddle themselves with, getting into professional schools or scholarships to alleviate some of that debt. I think the question is, if I had a simple question, it would probably be, do we need to abolish that meritocracy? I'm not going to ask that, though, because I'm searching for solutions. Imagine what we could do if we were unleashed from that, and how active we could become. So, not to any specific person on the panel, but are there any specific ideas that you might have on how to dismantle a meritocracy?
Oh, thank you very much. Joel.
I think that one of the things that's really important, at least to be practical, is to acknowledge that universities as they are have a sorting role. And so we can acknowledge that that role exists. As a first step, I would also like to abolish the meritocracy, but as a first step, let's at least separate the sorting role from the education role. And this comes back to like the chat GPT that came before. Everyone is wringing their hands about how all these kids who are going to cheat using chat GPT. Well, and then professors are coming up with ways to stop the cheating. It's like an arms race, right? We're going to employ AI to detect AI, but that's another thing. I mean, what if we just changed the incentives for schooling so that the incentive was not to cheat, but to learn? As long as there's a sorting mechanism for schooling, the incentive is going to be to cheat, of course, right? So let's separate those roles. I leave it to my other panelists to say, how do we get rid of the sorting mechanism? I took the low-hanging fruit.
Give a short answer, yeah? Okay.
She says
For
short
such a
answer.
big...
I
for
said, okay,
no, please, go ahead.
I do think that we are faced with a challenge with dealing with this idea of meritocracy, because universities are institutions that are part of the political economy, and it's not just the teaching and learning, it's about the journal publications, it's about the sorting mechanisms that discipline us into more and more narrow ways of generating knowledge and where we put them, but also our tenure and promotion, awards and systems are all anchored on this kind of hierarchy. So that we do need to dismantle that. There are efforts underway. It's an institution, so it's going to be slow, but I do think it needs to be. We need to continue to push it in terms of how we assess not just students, but also how we assess faculty and staff as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My question's for Joel, and it builds on some of the comments that both Joel and Jonathan mentioned here, that learning isn't necessarily linear in both time and space, and there's a value and a role for what is lifelong learning for us. And in my experience, education was a lifeline out of what was childhood poverty and a cycle of that. But we're seeing that education is more than just the 12 weeks of a class, getting the class content and moving on, but we're seeing also within governments, provincially, federally, internationally, moving towards what is this idea that you can break content down into granular, hyper-focused content that's decoupled.
Can you ask your question, please, just
Yes.
because we have two more and very little time left.
How do we push back against that narrative that we can accelerate that education and break it down from that longer system that we currently have in place?
Yeah, just very briefly, I think Linda gave us part of the answer for that, which is that re-emphasizing that education is about relationships. And relationships are, of course, circular. We come back to them, we loop them, we gain new information and move forward. And I think education has to be done similarly. Sure, we have courses, and the worst case scenario is what we used to call correspondence courses, now we call asynchronous learning. And the best case scenario is a tight-knit community where different courses are going on at different times, but where we loop back through the curriculum our entire time in the university.
Thank you very much. The last two questions here. Please go ahead.
Thanks. I'll try to be brief. I just wanted to try and center the student experience quickly. So we live in a university experience where students are working 40 hours a week and taking full-time classes, right? So we're not going to get that imaginative, creative institution with robust intellectual discussions. So what I want to know is, we live in, as I said, an age where tuition now accounts for a greater part of university funding than public funding. So sometimes when we call universities public institutions, I'm a bit confused because they're more like private institutions. So what I really want to know is, how do we get a change in the funding model? Because unless we're able to do that, I think a lot of what we have discussed here tonight will never become a reality. So what do we need to do to reimagine how universities are funded?
Activism.
I was just thinking this. Engage students.
There you go.
But this is where public engagement, not just with universities, but also as civic engagement, with your elected representative, with people who are making decisions about how much funding universities get, with the Board of Governors about setting tuition standards. We need more public and engaged students, because the students are more likely to be listened to than faculty and staff. And we also need parents actively involved in saying, we want university accessible and available and affordable for our kids.
Thank you.
And also mature learners.
Thank you. Last question.
Yes, I also wanted to speak about funding. We should all be out on the street demanding more funding for universities. And we had a model with the Saskatchewan Teachers Association just last week. They had thousands out in front of the ledge. So we can do that too. But I also have a question for people who work at universities, how the funding they have gets spent. Universities have more and more administrators. They are paid very high salaries. The top level of academics are paid very high salaries, whereas the sessionals are totally exploited. So there's something wrong with what is done with the funding.
And is there someone you're directing a question to?
No, just anybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your comments. Ladies and gentlemen, okay.
I would like to say, though, that it is accurate that more and more teaching in universities are being performed by contract or sessional faculty. And I actually think we need to recognize that this is also about valuing knowledge and the contributions to what university life is like. And so to the extent that they are underpaid or under-recognized for the knowledge and contributions to the university, it is something that we need to correct. It is an equity issue.
And with that, we'll say thank you for the wonderful questions. Thank you for the amazing answers. And thank you for what you do on a daily basis, every single one of you. Thank you.